Are you sure you know what the Middle Ages were like? Lust, prohibitions, sin, cruel rules, and secret passions. How did the church control the bodies and desires of millions of people? Why was intimacy considered a sin, but brothels operated legally? And did feudal lords really have the right of the first night, or is this all a beautiful lie invented later? In this video, we will explore what happened in the bedrooms of medieval people, what prohibitions they violated, and why their sex lives were monitored by priests, neighbors, and the authorities. And most importantly, did they have any freedom in love at all? Don't switch channels. The most interesting part will start in a minute. This video will definitely change your perception of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the church played a central role in people's lives, not only as a religious institution, but also as a moral, legal, and social authority. People perceived Christianity not as an abstract ideology, but as a system that governed every aspect of their existence, from their daily routine to their thoughts about their own bodies. Sex in this system was considered one of the strongest manifestations of man's sinful nature. Lust was considered a cause of mortal sins, and the pursuit of pleasure was seen as a weakness, leading to spiritual decline. Therefore, the church sought to keep the intimate sphere under strict control, not out of festive interest, but out of a desire to save souls and preserve public morality. In addition, control over sexuality was part of an overall strategy. By controlling the most personal part of a person's life, the church strengthened its influence and reinforced the hierarchy. The body became not personal, but public and accountable, not only to God, but also to church authorities. In medieval Christian morality, sex was seen as something inherently sinful, a legacy of original sin, and a weakness of the flesh that humans had to overcome. Sex for pleasure was especially frowned upon. Pleasure was equated with lust, and lust with spiritual degradation. The church allowed sexual relations only within marriage and exclusively for one purpose: the conception of children. Even between spouses, too frequent sex was condemned, especially if it was passionate. Love and attraction, in the Christian understanding, had no right to physical expression unless there was a higher purpose behind it, the continuation of the species. Any attempt to make a sex pure pleasure, whether through caresses, unconventional positions, or the use of contraception, was automatically considered a sin. In the eyes of the church, a person should not enjoy their body, but endure and restrain it. Thus, even lawful sexual intercourse within marriage became a spiritual test, something that had to be endured rather than enjoyed. The church not only determined when it was permissible to engage in sexual activity, but also the specific position in which it was acceptable. Essentially, the only position deemed acceptable was the so-called missionary position, the man on top, the woman on the bottom. This was not merely a matter of convenience. The church viewed this position as a symbol of the proper order. Firstly, it was considered natural, in line with the divine plan, where the man dominates and the woman submits. Thus, even in intimate relations, the church hierarchy was preserved, the man as the head of the family and as the image of God, the woman as a submissive helper. Second, the missionary position was considered the least arousing, and therefore the least sinful. The purpose of the act was not to be pleasure, but conception, and any attempt to enhance physical pleasure was seen as a departure from the spiritual path. All other positions, especially Those that could symbolize equality or a reversal of roles were considered not only indecent, but also dangerous for the soul. Some spiritual authors explicitly stated that if spouses violated this order, they risked committing a mortal sin even while married. Thus, intimate life became a strictly regulated activity, where even the position of the bodies was subject to religious discipline. Intimate life in the Middle Ages was strictly regulated, not only in form, but also in time. The church established clear rules. There were days, weeks, and even months when sexual relations were strictly prohibited. Violating these prohibitions was considered a sin, even if it involved lawful spouses. First of all, sex was forbidden on Sundays, the day dedicated to God. All religious holidays, days of remembrance of saints, and numerous fasts were also prohibited. And there were quite a few such periods in a year: Lent, Christmas fast, fasts before Easter, Pentecost, and others. As a result, almost half of the calendar year could be untouchable in a sexual sense. In addition, in some regions, there were local traditions that added additional restrictions. For example, a ban on sex on the days before communion or on frightful nights when, according to popular belief, evil forces were particularly active. The purpose of these prohibitions was to keep the body and spirit in a state of purity, especially during sacred times. Sex was considered carnal and therefore a distraction from prayer, repentance, and the divine. Even in marriage, it was permissible only as a necessity, not as a normal part of life. As a result, intimate life became a schedule. When it was possible, it was tolerated. When it was not possible, it was a sin. And not only the people themselves had to follow this schedule, but also the priests who confessed their flock. The medieval church categorically condemned any attempts to prevent childbirth. Contraception was perceived as a deliberate distortion of the natural order established by God. If sex means children, anything that interfered with this process was considered a sin and a violation of divine will. Abortion was equated with murder, regardless of the stage of pregnancy. A woman who terminated her pregnancy automatically became a criminal in the eyes of the church. Moreover, not only women were punished, but also those who helped them, midwives, healers, even husbands, if they knew about or supported such a decision. However, in practice, the situation was not so clear-cut. Despite the prohibitions, contraceptive methods were used, albeit primitive ones: herbs, tinctures, spells, and mechanical methods of protection. Similarly, in circumvention of church prohibitions, there were clandestine abortions. They were performed in secret, often in dangerous conditions, which often led to death or serious complications. Such shadow practices indicate that medieval people, despite pressure from the church, still sought ways to control their reproductive lives. This was especially true for women, as they bore the main risk and social responsibility for pregnancy. The church's control was strong but not absolute, and reality, as always, was more complex than official morality. In the medieval Christian worldview, women were seen as a potential source of sin, weak, carnal, prone to temptation, and most importantly, capable of tempting others. This image was largely shaped by the biblical story of Eve, who was the first to break God's prohibition and persuade Adam to taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge. According to the church, it was with her that humanity began its path to fall and suffering. It was believed that women, by their very nature, were closer to the physical and earthly than men. They aroused desire, awakened lust, and thus posed a threat to men's spiritual well-being. Hence the desire to control her behavior, appearance, sexuality, and even thoughts. Women, especially those outside of marriage, were often perceived as potential seductresses, instruments of the devil. According to the logic of the time, it was because of her that a man could fall, stray from the righteous path, and lose his salvation. Therefore, society elevated female virginity, modesty, silence, and submission to a cult. The image of the ideal woman was not a lover and partner, but rather a humble servant, deprived of her own will and passion. This attitude not only suppressed female sexuality, but also made women themselves objects of suspicion, guilt, and control. Their sinfulness was not an act, but a default state from which they could only be cleansed through marriage, motherhood, and complete submission to church norms. In medieval Europe, female sexuality was perceived as something dangerous and destructive. It was necessary not to reveal it, but to suppress it, to control, shame, and hide it. Virginity became the main ideal for women, elevated to a cult status. The church and society instilled the idea that a truly virtuous woman was one who was chaste, silent, and completely submissive to the will of men and God. A woman's sexuality was perceived as a source of evil, capable of leading a man astray, destroying his soul, and disrupting social order. Therefore, girls were required to be absolutely pure before marriage, and wives were required to be obedient and modest in their marital life. The manifestation of desire, passion, or initiative was considered shameful, and in some cases even a sign of witchcraft. Women were taught to be ashamed of their own bodies. Revealing clothing, talking about feelings, and interest in intimate life were all condemned. Any woman who went beyond what was acceptable risked being accused of debauchery or even collusion with the devil. And in the context of the church's power over morality and physicality, such accusations could cost her her freedom, reputation, or life. Thus, the suppression of female sexuality was not accidental but systematic. It served as an instrument of social control and emphasized the main tenet of the era. A woman should be passive, invisible, and controllable, not a subject but an object in someone else's value system. Sex outside marriage in medieval society was considered a grave sin, especially for women. Men could be forgiven for such mistakes, especially if they held high positions or were widowers, but the standards for women were much stricter. It was believed that any virtuous woman was obliged to remain chaste until marriage, and if she did not, she lost not only respect, but also her chances for a normal life. A woman who had sexual relations before or outside of marriage was branded as fallen. This condemnation was not only moral in nature, but also had very real social consequences. She could be rejected by potential suitors, turned away by her relatives, and sometimes by the entire community. It was difficult for such a woman to get married, which meant securing protection, status, and a normal existence. In addition, pregnancy outside of marriage was perceived as a disgrace, not only for the woman herself, but also for her entire family. This could turn into a real disaster. The girl could be expelled, sent to a convent, or forced to atone through public repentance. For commoners, unprotected by money or status, this could effectively mean social death. And if a woman tried to hide her pregnancy or resorted to abortion, she also risked persecution, by the church or the courts. Thus, a woman's sexuality outside of marriage was not only condemned, it threatened her entire future. This made women's intimate lives not a matter of personal choice, but an arena of constant fear, pressure, and subjugation. Contrary to the widespread myth that girls in the Middle Ages married at the age of 12 to 14, historians note that in many regions of Europe, especially among the peasantry and urban population, first marriages occurred quite late, at around 23 to 25 years of age. The reasons for this were quite pragmatic. Before starting a family, it was necessary to accumulate resources, acquire housing, and negotiate between families. Often, young people lived in their parents' home for a long time, or were hired as servants in order to save up a dowry or money for a household. However, this late entry into marriage had a downside. Female sexuality remained under the total control of society for many years. A girl had to remain a virgin until marriage, despite her natural desires and lack of privacy. Her every move was monitored by relatives, neighbors, and the church. Any suspicion could result in disgrace. At the same time, marriage did not guarantee freedom. A woman passed from the authority of her father to that of her husband. Her main responsibility was considered to be childbearing, and marriage was perceived as a duty to the family, God, and society, rather than a personal choice or a union based on love. Thus, late marriage did not give women greater autonomy. On the contrary, it prolonged the period of strict control over their behavior. A girl had to be perfect before marriage and submissive after it, and any deviation from these norms was perceived as a blatant fall from grace. In the Middle Ages, women were often victims of violence, both within and outside the family. However, there was almost no one to protect them. Both the church and secular authorities primarily protected order, family honor, and the authority of the husband, rather than the rights of women themselves. Domestic violence was almost never considered a crime. It was believed that a man had the right to discipline his wife and punish her for disobedience. A married woman was seen more as her husband's property than as an equal partner. If her husband beat her or forced her to have sex, it was not seen as violence, but as a family matter in which no one should interfere. A woman's complaints could be ignored or turned against her, as this meant that she was disgracing the family and violating the hierarchy. The church, although it preached mercy, was not quick to side with women. On the contrary, priests often reminded women of their duty to endure suffering for the sake of the salvation of their souls. The image of the ideal wife was a patient, meek martyr who submissively endured humiliation and misfortune, considering them a test from God. As for secular laws, they also mainly protected the interests of men and feudal lords, even if the violence was not committed within the family, but, for example, by a lord or servant. It was extremely difficult for women to obtain justice. Their word often had no legal force, especially without witnesses. Thus, in a society where a man's honor was more important than a woman's safety, violence was not only widespread, it was perceived as the norm. And even those who suffered rarely had the opportunity or the right to speak out about it. The right of the first night is a widely known myth that in the Middle Ages, feudal lords had the legal right to spend the first wedding night with the bride of any of their subjects. Supposedly, before a girl became a wife, she was obliged to give herself to her lord as a sign of submission and dependence. This image is often found in films, books, and popular culture, where it symbolizes the cruelty, arbitrariness, and barbarism of the feudal system. For many people, the rite of the first night has become one of the most vivid and shocking stereotypes about the Middle Ages. However, historical data does not confirm the existence of such a law. Despite the vividness of this myth, no mention has been found in any legal source from the Middle Ages that a feudal lord actually had the official right to sexual intimacy with the brides of peasants. But the myth itself proves so convincing that it continues to live on to this day. Despite its widespread popularity, the myth of the rite of the first night is not a legacy of the Middle Ages, but a product of the Enlightenment, i.e., the 18th century. It appeared much later than the period to which it supposedly refers. Moreover, it was created not by historians, but by philosophers, writers, and educators who sought to discredit the feudal system and show how dark and barbaric the past was. The main purpose of this myth was to contrast the new, rational, and enlightened society with the outdated and unjust feudalism. This required a vivid image of despotism and violence, and the idea that a feudal lord allegedly had the right to the body of another man's wife was perfect for this role. This myth was particularly actively exploited in literature and political texts of the 18th to 19th centuries. The myth was fueled by folk legends in which landowners and lords were often portrayed as depraved and unpunished, but in reality, no legal documents confirming the right of the first night have been found. Most likely, it was a matter of cases of violence or abuse of power, which, of course, did occur, but were not legalized. Thus, the myth of the rite of the first night is not a historical fact, but a political tool created to show how much more civilized the world had become in the modern era. Although the rite of the first night is a myth, it cannot be denied that feudal lords wielded enormous real power over their subjects. In the Middle Ages, they were not merely landowners, but full-fledged rulers in their territories. They collected taxes, enacted laws, administered justice, and controlled almost every aspect of peasant life. A feudal lord could dispose of the labor force, land, crops, and even the marriages of his subjects. It was impossible to marry without the lord's permission, especially if the people lived on his land. Some feudal lords sought to control not only property, but also offspring. For example, they could try to secure the right to a woman's children if she lived on someone else's territory before marriage. This opened the door to abuse. If a feudal lord wanted to use his position to force a girl into sex or offer her his favor in exchange for protection, he could do so without much fear of consequences. Women had virtually no legal leverage to resist arbitrariness. There was no formal right of the first night, but power that was not limited by laws and institutions gave feudal lords the opportunity to violate boundaries, especially with regard to defenseless women. Violence by the nobility, unfortunately, was a reality, even if it was not legalized. The myth of the rite of the first night proved incredibly resilient, and not just because of its shocking nature. It fit neatly into the convenient image of the Middle Ages as a dark, cruel, and backward era, which was actively formed during the Enlightenment and later. People readily believed the story of how powerless peasants gave their wives to the feudal lord for one night, because it confirmed the idea of progress. Look how terrible it was then, and how reasonable it is now. This myth became a symbol of feudal despotism, a kind of calling card for a supposedly inhuman past. It reinforced negative stereotypes about the Middle Ages: obscurantism, filth, violence, oppression. In the mass consciousness, the Middle Ages became associated with the arbitrariness of the nobility, the humiliation of the common people, and a complete lack of morality, although the historical reality was much more complex and diverse. In addition, the myth was actively used in literature, theater, and later in cinema. After all, it easily evokes an emotional response and creates dramatic conflict. As a result, even today, many people perceive the rite of the first night as a historical fact without thinking about its origins. Thus, the myth has influenced not only the image of the Middle Ages, but also how we understand history in general. It shows that some ideas about the past may not be knowledge, but convenient artistic fiction that simply fits well into the desired narrative. The myth of the rite of the first night is far from the only fiction that has become firmly entrenched in our ideas about the Middle Ages. This era is surrounded by a whole cloud of stereotypes that do not stand up to historical criticism. One of the most popular myths is that people in the Middle Ages hardly ever washed. In fact, hygiene was given a lot of attention. There were baths in cities, and monasteries had special rules of cleanliness. Bathhouses were part of urban culture, and washing was considered not only a hygienic, but also a moral practice. Another myth is the belief that everyone thought the earth was flat. This is not true. Educated people already knew about the sphericity of the planet in the Middle Ages, and this knowledge had been preserved since ancient times. The myth of the flat earth became popular in the 19th century as a way to show the darkness of the past against the backdrop of the light of science. This also includes the idea of total illiteracy, that everyone lived in fear of witches, witch trials were widespread in modern times, or that medicine did not exist at all. All these myths served one purpose: to show the Middle Ages as a wild, dark, and lawless time, so that the contrast with the present day would seem brighter. But history is usually much more complex and multi-layered than its caricatured images. The official position of the Church in the Middle Ages was unequivocal. Sex was not a pleasure, but a necessity, permissible only for the purpose of conceiving children and only within marriage. Anything that went beyond these boundaries was considered a sin. Passion, attraction, caresses, inappropriate positions. All of this was condemned as a manifestation of lust, one of the main threats to the salvation of the soul. But real life, as is often the case, followed its own rules. People did not cease to be human, and no prohibitions could completely suppress their desires, needs, and longing for intimacy. Despite the fear of sin and punishment in the afterlife, men and women continued to have sex, and not always according to the Church's schedule, and not only for the sake of procreation. Preserved confessional lists, church court documents, and sermons from that time, directly or indirectly, confirm that the forbidden often happened, and the Church was forced to fight it constantly. This suggests that people's intimate lives were much freer than the religious authorities would have liked. Simply put, norms and reality diverged. The Church prescribed one thing, and people did another, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly. This eternal conflict between official morality and living human nature made the Middle Ages not only an era of restrictions, but also an era of constant balance between prohibition and personal choice. Despite strict morals and church prohibitions, prostitution in the Middle Ages was not only widespread, It was practically official. The church openly condemned it as a sin, but at the same time, paradoxically, often tolerated its existence. Prostitution was seen as a necessary evil, a kind of safety valve for male lust. The logic was as follows: if there were no brothels, men would begin to seduce respectable women, and that would be much worse. This was the reasoning not only of city authorities, but also of many church authorities. Even St. Augustine wrote that without prostitution, society could collapse from lust. Therefore, in some cities, brothels existed on a completely legal basis and sometimes even brought income to the local treasury. The paradox was that women who worked in brothels were both tolerated and despised. Their activities were regulated. In some places, they were forbidden to walk the streets at certain times, wear expensive clothes, or marry. They had to pay taxes, rent, and fines, and at the same time had no rights. Thus, prostitution was built into the social order, even though it was condemned in words. This double standard reflects the general attitude toward sexuality in the Middle Ages. Natural desire was recognized but subject to strict constraints, even if this required hypocrisy and contradictions. The church authorities of the Middle Ages never tired of issuing prohibitions. Hundreds of documents, treatises, sermons, and decrees condemned everything: extramarital sex, masturbation, unconventional positions, the use of contraception, passion between spouses, even thoughts of sexual pleasure. It would seem that with such a scale of ideological work, society should have been completely chaste, but in reality, the opposite was true. The more the church prohibited, the more obvious it became that people continued to engage in what was formerly considered a sin. It is precisely the number of prohibitive texts and the severity of the wording that tell us that these sinful practices were not rare, but the everyday norm. If no one had broken the rules, there would have been no need to repeat and tighten them so often. But the church regularly returned to the same topics, which indicates the constant and widespread indiscipline of the flock. People lived their intimate lives in their own way, within the framework of customs, needs, and desires, and not only religious prescriptions. This highlights an important paradox of the Middle Ages. The power of the church was enormous, but not absolute. It could dictate how things should be, but it could not completely change how things were. And behind all the rhetoric about sin, chastity, and punishment lay a very lively physical and stubbornly human reality. One of the most eloquent proofs that the church's calls for abstinence were widely ignored was the syphilis epidemic that swept across Europe in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The disease spread rapidly and widely, affecting cities, villages, palaces, and monasteries. If sexual life had really been strictly subject to church rules, such a scale of infection simply could not have occurred. Syphilis became a kind of indicator of people's real behavior. It showed that intimate relationships, both casual and permanent, were part of everyday life, despite strict morals and fear of sin. The disease spared neither social classes nor the clergy. Among those infected were knights, merchants, monks, and commoners. The church tried to interpret the epidemic as God's punishment for debauchery, but in reality, it was a reflection of a life in which prohibitions and reality were at odds. People continued to have sex outside of marriage, visit brothels, and engage in secret relationships. And syphilis spread precisely through these forbidden channels. In addition, the lack of adequate medicine and the inability to talk openly about such diseases only exacerbated the situation. The disease spread not only quickly, but also shamefully. People tried to keep quiet about it, and those infected often remained without help. Thus, the epidemic became tacit but vivid proof that the church's model of behavior did not work well in real life. People remained human, with their desires, passions, and vulnerabilities. Medieval society was built on strict morals. The church condemned carnal pleasures and preached chastity, modesty, and control over the body. However, behind the facade of these ideals lay a reality full of contradictions. The same institutions that prohibited sexual relations outside of marriage turned a blind eye to the existence of brothels, secret affairs, and abuse of power. This is a classic example of double standards. For ordinary people, especially women, there were certain rules. Any deviation was punished with shame and public condemnation. But for noble, rich, or influential men, deviations from the norm were much more often forgiven. Their lust was not considered so dangerous and sometimes even justified. The church, in turn, also demonstrated hypocrisy. On the one hand, it condemned sin in words, but on the other, it tolerated its manifestations if they were socially or economically necessary. Prostitution, for example, became part of urban life, and confessions about indecent deeds were so common that entire sets of questions on the subject of sexual sins had to be developed. This gap between official morality and everyday life not only undermined trust in church institutions, but also turned morality into an instrument of control, selective, flexible, and convenient for those in power. Morality was universal, but it was applied selectively, depending on gender, status, and interests. This is what makes the Middle Ages not just an era of prohibitions, but a time of constant compromise, contradictions, and struggle between the norm and reality. In medieval times, the concept of personal space was virtually non-existent. Privacy, as we understand it today, was a luxury that simply did not exist. Every step, every action was visible to others, family members, neighbors, authorities, and of course, the church. People lived in cramped houses, often with several generations under one roof. There were practically no rooms, at most a curtain or partition. Everyone knew who slept with whom, who quarreled with whom, who went where and why. Even a couple's intimate life was not a completely private matter. The community participated in some way in monitoring the couple's behavior, either directly or through rumors, denunciations, and confessions. The church actively encouraged such openness. Priests confessed people, asked them in detail about their sinful deeds, gave advice, and sometimes reported them to the authorities. Even secular authorities interfered in private life. For example, they monitored marriages, births, and moral violations, and neighbors and relatives, in a tightly knit social structure, became voluntary observers and judges. Such total control made it impossible not only to openly express sexuality, but also to engage in any behavior that went beyond the norms. People lived with a constant feeling that they were being watched, and this feeling fostered submissiveness, fear, and a habit of self-control. Medieval society was not just religious, it was collective. There was no place for loneliness and isolation, and therefore no place for truly free choice in personal life. Intimate life in the Middle Ages was rarely truly intimate. People lived in large families, in small, cramped houses, where parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes neighbors or hired workers could huddle under one roof. There were practically no private rooms, at most, a curtain, a partition, or a corner by the stove. In such conditions, finding privacy for intimacy was a difficult task even for married couples. Often, sex had to be built into everyday life, when everyone was asleep, when the children were out, when someone had gone to the market or to the fields. There was simply no space where one could be alone, neither in the house nor outside it. In addition, the open architecture of rural and urban life only exacerbated the situation. Shared courtyards, shared walls, thin floors, all this made the sounds and movements easily audible to those around. Any intimacy could become the property of the neighbors and often became the subject of gossip. This openness had a strong impact on sexual culture. People learned to hide, adapt, and observe external propriety. Sex became not just a physiological act, but an act of ingenuity, a secret ritual, almost like a rule-breaking act, even if it took place between spouses. Thus, in the Middle Ages, sexuality was under constant scrutiny, and even lawful intimacy required caution and ingenuity. Intimacy, as we understand it today, was a virtually unattainable luxury. In the Middle Ages, the Church established strict rules regarding when, how, with whom, and why one could engage in sexual activity. There were numerous prohibitions, ranging from positions and frequency of intimacy to days of the week and periods of abstinence. It would appear that everything was controlled. However, in reality, people, as always, found ways to circumvent the system. Human nature and life circumstances made it almost impossible to fully follow church morality. So, people got creative. Spouses chose moments of privacy when the house was empty or everyone was asleep. Young people arranged business dates, supposedly going to fetch water, but in fact, meeting in a barn, a field, or at the edge of a forest. Even priests did not always strictly follow the rules. Some turned a blind eye to the minor transgressions of their parishioners, while others themselves violated their vows of chastity. In some cases, clergymen became mediators in illegal relationships, for example, helping to hide an extramarital pregnancy or settle a family conflict. In addition, oral tradition and folk culture lived their own lives. In folklore, songs, and jokes, the theme of sex was constantly present, openly, crudely, and cheerfully. This was proof that real life did not fit into the pattern of sin, repentance, abstinence. Thus, medieval man lived between two realities, the official, moral one, and the unofficial, everyday one. And if the former dictated how things should be, the latter reminded us how things actually are. Although church morality in the Middle Ages was universal and uniform on paper, in practice it depended on who applied it, namely on the specific priest. The same sin could be perceived very differently in different parishes. In some places it was considered a mortal sin, while in others it was grounds for a mild reprimand and a prayer of repentance. Priests were human beings with their own views, personalities, levels of education, and life experiences. Some treated the intimate sphere with fanatical severity, monitoring every violation and instilling fear of the flesh in their flock. Such ministers could turn confession into an interrogation, demanding the smallest details and prescribing harsh penances even for innocent acts. Others, on the contrary, were much more lenient. Some understood that the church's prohibitions were too detached from real life and turned a blind eye to minor transgressions or advised formal repentance for the sake of observing rituals, but without undue pressure. This was especially true in rural parishes where priests lived alongside their flock and understood their needs and realities. Sometimes the clergy themselves violated their vows. There are known cases when priests had mistresses, illegitimate children, or visited brothels. This, of course, was considered a violation of the canons, but it did not always become a reason for church punishment, especially if the person had influence or support from the local nobility. Thus, the level of church control over sexual life depended not only on the laws, but also on the personality of those who represented these laws locally. And in many ways, this is what made morality not universal, but flexible and contradictory. While the church preached morality, chastity, and abstinence, the feudal lords were interested in something else entirely: birth rates. For landowners, it was not so much the spiritual qualities of their subjects that mattered as their numbers. Every new child was a potential worker, taxpayer, and soldier. The more people lived on a feudal lord's land, the richer and more powerful he became. Therefore, secular authorities often viewed the intimate lives of commoners from a pragmatic point of view. It did not matter how, when, or with whom. The main thing was that the peasants reproduced. Feudal lords could even interfere in marriage matters, prohibit divorces, force people into marriage, or encourage large families, all for the sake of increasing the workforce. Sometimes it reached the point of absurdity. A feudal lord could try to legally secure the right to a woman's children if she lived on someone else's territory before marriage. In such cases, the dispute was not about morality or feelings, but literally about property, whose future peasants would be, who would pay the rent. Thus, feudal interests were extremely utilitarian. Intimate life had value only when it became an economic resource. The question of sin, purity, or permissibility took a back seat to questions of taxes, the army, and the productivity of the village. Morality regulated behavior from the point of view of saving the soul, while the feudal lord regulated it from the point of view of profitable demographics.